Welcome to Linguistics Tube. This episode is part of my series which explores the skills involved in public speaking. Through these episodes, you will learn and practice several essential techniques that will allow you to perform public speeches successfully and easily. In this episode, we will discuss a method of helping the audience to follow the structure of your speech. Specifically, we will explore the technique of signposting, which contains several methods that help the audience to understand and follow you throughout your speech. These methods will help to enhance the structure of your speech. In the context of an argumentative speech, the word signposting is actually a metaphor. If you are a Chinese speaker, then you can see an appropriate translation of the metaphorical meaning at the top of the screen. However, it will help us to understand this concept if we firstly understand the literal, original meaning of this word. So, I would like you to guess the basic meaning of this word. What is a signpost? Please pause the video to think about this, and continue when ready. Here is a picture of a real, literal signpost. If this is what you guessed a signpost is, then you are correct. Literally, in the real world, a signpost is a physical sign that displays information for drivers and pedestrians. They usually contain information such as the direction to a place and the distance to that place. In the metaphorical context of an argumentative speech, signposts are not physical signs, but important spoken statements that the speaker uses during his or her speech. Signposts aid the audience's understanding of exactly which point the speaker is at in his or her overall speech, just like a signpost on a road tells the driver exactly which point he or she is at in his or her overall journey. If you are a Chinese speaker, then here is an explanation in Chinese. Please pause the video and read it yourself now. 'In this episode, I will share with you 7 methods of signposting, along with several examples. All of the examples you will see are for the argumentative speech topic, smoking should be banned in public places. We previously saw examples of evidence for this topic in the episode about the body section of an argumentative speech. Anyway, before we see the 7 techniques, I would like to briefly explain why signposting is very useful and important throughout your speech. I can think of 2 main reasons. Firstly, they contribute to the overall structure of your speech. And remember that structure is one of the most important aspects of a well-written public speech. Secondly, signposts keep the audience interested and help them to understand and follow the different sections of the speech. This is especially important in a speech rather than an essay, because the audience cannot read your speech while you speak. Therefore, giving the audience extra guidance and information about which part of your speech you are in will help them to pay attention to your speech, and this will increase the likelihood that they will listen carefully and thus be persuaded by it. Let's now look at those 7 techniques. I'll refer to the first technique as moving on to a new point, because these are the key words that you will use to create your signpost. When you finish an argument and want to discuss the next one, it is important to tell the audience. Because you are taking the audience from one point to another, the audience is moving between points. So, moving is a metaphor here, because no one is actually physically moving. You can use this signpost when moving between the arguments inside the body section. Thus, from argument 1 to argument 2, or argument 2 to argument 3. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these two examples. Moving on to my next point, it is clear that second-hand smoke harms non-smokers. I'd now like to move on to my second point, where we will be discussing the harm second-hand smoke causes to non-smokers. You can see that the grammar is fairly flexible. The second useful signpost can be used when changing your topic completely. This is different from the first signpost, which is used to move between arguments within the body section. Instead, the second signpost is used when moving between the three main speech sections. In other words, when moving from the introduction to the body, or from the body to the conclusion. In this signpost, we use the phrase turn to something, such as turn to the body section, or turn to the conclusion. This signpost is very helpful because when you change the topic completely, you must make it very clear for the audience. If you don't clearly signal that you have moved to the next major section of the speech, the audience could get confused or lost within the detail of your speech. This signpost is again another metaphor, because in order to move to the next section of the speech, the audience turns to the new topic, just like turning the page of a book to a new chapter, or the driver turning the car around to go in a different direction. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these two examples. Now, let's turn to the arguments for my point of view. Firstly, now, turning to my conclusion. In my speech, I have argued that the third signpost can be used when the speaker wants to discuss something in more detail. Specifically, it can be used within a body paragraph to move from your topic sentence to your support, such as your evidence, because the topic sentence introduces your reason, and then you naturally discuss it in more detail. This signpost helps the audience to understand what point you are at in your speech, because when the audience hears this signpost, they will know that the speaker is still discussing the same topic, but focusing on it in more detail and giving more information about it. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these three examples. Let me elaborate on this. Expanding on the issue that second-hand smoke harms non-smokers, a recent study showed that I want to talk more in depth about the suffering of children caused by smokers. You can see that there is not only one way to go into more detail. You can use the phrases elaborate on, expand on, and talk in depth. Next is the fourth signposting technique. When giving a speech, it is often necessary to briefly discuss something off topic. You will do this when you want to discuss an important point which is not directly related to the argument you are making, but is somehow linked indirectly to your topic. A good analogy to help explain this is to think about literal signposts and a literal car journey. If you are driving north to your eventual destination, you may briefly go east to see a famous landmark or to visit a friend in a nearby city. But afterwards, you will continue driving north to your main destination. The principle is the same in an argumentative speech. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these 3 examples. Let me digress and briefly discuss the related issue of drinking alcohol in public. As a side note, this issue has many similarities with the issue of. Going off on a tangent, I believe it is important to discuss the issue of. Like with the third signpost, you can see that there is more than one way to briefly discuss something off topic. You can use the phrases digress, side note, and on a tangent. The 5th type of signpost involves repetition. Specifically, you will tell the audience, through a signpost, that you will repeat a point that you stated earlier. In general, repetition is an important technique in public speaking for making sure that the audience understands an important point. Thus, it is very common to repeat something you have already said. However, in order to emphasize the repetition more, you can tell the audience, through this signpost, that you are about to repeat something. After the signpost, you can repeat the point you said earlier. So, why is this technique effective? Well, while it is true that you can simply repeat the point without telling the audience that you will repeat yourself, using a signpost can draw specific attention to the repetition to give it more emphasis. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these 3 examples. Recapping the previous point I made about the death rate of non-smokers as a result of secondhand smoke, it is undeniable that this is hugely unfair. Let me repeat that. It is hugely unfair that non-smokers are dying through no fault of their own. This is really important, so I'm going to say it again. It is hugely. Like before, you can see that there is more than one way to repeat points stated earlier. You can use the phrases recap, repeat that, and I am going to say it again. The 6th type of signpost can be used when you want to summarize an important point you have made in your speech. Specifically, you could use this signpost in your wrap-up sentence at the end of each body paragraph, or at the end of your evidence section when you've discussed something in detail, such as a lengthy study, and you want to summarize the study's most important points at the end of the evidence section. In general, it is important to summarize throughout your speech, because it is likely that the audience could get confused by the detail of your explanation. So summarizing something that you have discussed in detail immediately afterwards helps the audience remember the point and understand it more simply. In other words, a summary provides the audience with a simplified version of the important content of your speech, and signposting to the audience that you are about to present a summary ensures they will listen and pay attention to it. So it is likely that they will remember and thus be persuaded by it. Let's look at some examples. I'll now read these 3 examples. Summarizing what I've just talked about, it is unfair for children to suffer from health problems when they go to the park to play. To summarize, I have argued that it is unfair for. In summary, this survey found that many children suffer from health problems when. Like before, you can see that there is more than one way to summarize a point. In general, they all revolve around variations of the word summarize. Finally, it is important to summarize when you reach the final section of the speech, the conclusion. You will use this signpost at the beginning of the first part of the conclusion, the thesis echo. This is because it is important to use a signpost to tell the audience that you are concluding. It is effective because it is possible that the audience will have lost their focus or attention throughout the final argument. The audience pay attention to the conclusion, so it is important to remind them that they have reached the final main section of the speech, and this can easily be achieved with a signpost. You should use one of the following phrases to introduce your thesis echo. In conclusion is the most common choice, but there are more unusual and interesting ones to choose. Here are some examples. In conclusion, to close this off, to finish up, I'd like to conclude now. In closing, if I may conclude. After this, you can say a few words like, I have argued that. It is clear from the above arguments that. My above analysis demonstrates that. This will lead to your thesis echo. If you want to learn more about the thesis echo, then watch the episode in this series about the conclusion of a public speech. This is the end of the episode about signposting. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my public speaking skills series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.